The turning point came in 2019, when the Spanish Association of Victims of Jehovah's Witnesses was formed. From the very beginning, the Watchtower was monitoring this association. But as it grew and began gaining greater visibility, the Watchtower decided to sue them. What was the Watchtower's argument? Their argument was that they do not produce victims, and therefore the mere existence of an association of victims of Jehovah's Witnesses was damaging their honor. In other words, according to them, the association was harming their reputation. For that reason, the Watchtower decided to sue the Spanish Association, seeking, and this was literally their request before the Spanish state, the dissolution of the Spanish Association of Victims of Jehovah's Witnesses. From the beginning, this struggle was clearly a David versus Goliath battle. Obviously, the Watchtower has not only millions, but billions of dollars in resources. They arrived with an American law firm and an entire legal team. By contrast, the Spanish Association of Victims did not, and still does not to this day, have the financial resources of the Watchtower. They hired a local lawyer named Carlos Bardavillo, a very competent lawyer, very passionate about the cause, but obviously without the resources the Watchtower had. While the Watchtower arrived with a whole legal team, Carlos Bardavillo arrived with only a legal intern. In other words, there was clearly no balance of power. In fact, the trial started badly for the Association of Victims. At first, Carlos Bardavillo made a series of mistakes that led the judge to think he was drifting away from the central issue of the case. At times, it seemed as though he was trying to demonstrate that the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses were incorrect. But the trial was obviously not about whether the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses are right or wrong. The trial was about whether the Association of Victims was damaging the honor and reputation of Jehovah's Witnesses. So at the beginning, the judge clearly showed a certain degree of irritation with the way the defense was being presented. However, something very interesting happened afterward. There was a change, a real turning point during the trial. And why did that change occur? Because of two serious mistakes committed by Jehovah's Witnesses themselves. One of them, and it seems the judge noticed this perfectly, was that Jehovah's Witnesses, through several of their witnesses, and particularly through their spokesman in Spain, Aníbal Matos, blatantly lied. Let me mention three clear examples. The first was when Aníbal Matos claimed, and this appears in the documentary, that judicial committees are actually ecclesiastical committees. Come on. Those of us who have been Jehovah's Witnesses know perfectly well that in Watchtower publications the term ecclesiastical committees never appears. The second lie was when he claimed that Jehovah's Witnesses do not use the word worldly in a derogatory sense. According to Aníbal Matos, the word worldly simply means a person of the world, and he even claimed that Jehovah's Witnesses themselves are also considered worldly within the organization. But come on. Those of us who were Jehovah's Witnesses for years, in my case more than 20 years, know perfectly well that this is not true. We cannot be fooled so easily. We know perfectly well how that word is used inside the organization. And the third lie was the claim that shunning those who have been removed is optional, a matter of personal conscience. First, we need to clarify something important. This entire trial took place in 2023. That is, before the changes the organization announced in 2024. Changes which, by the way, do not mean that Jehovah's Witnesses can now socialize with those who have been removed. The only thing they can do is speak to them occasionally to invite them to meetings, or when they see them at the meetings. But regardless of that, Aníbal Matos claimed that refusing to speak to those who have been removed is optional, and that is not true. The Elder's Manual, the book Shepherd the Flock of God, clearly states that a person who continually socializes with someone who has been removed may be considered guilty of brazen conduct. And what happens to someone who persists in brazen conduct? That person can be removed. So if someone can be removed for socializing with someone who has been removed, then it is not optional. It is mandatory. So here we have at least three clear lies. And when someone says that Jehovah's Witnesses do not lie, then they are telling a double lie. And forgive me for saying it this way, but it is honestly outrageous to hear statements like that from Jehovah's Witnesses, especially from their official spokesman. The level of audacity is astonishing. In fact, it was precisely these lies that generated enormous outrage within the former witness community. Many people who until that moment had remained silent decided to speak publicly. That was the case, for example, with Soraya Nares. When Soraya saw the things that were being said during the trial, she decided to go to the media and express her position. Later, she even published a book. In other words, the Watchtower's attempt to silence the association of victims ended up producing exactly the opposite effect. It gave them a louder voice. It became a megaphone that amplified the message of the Spanish Association of Victims of Jehovah's Witnesses. But perhaps the worst mistake Jehovah's Witnesses made during the trial was another one. It was their attempt, frankly inhuman, to emotionally break the victims who were testifying. Instead of focusing on the alleged damage to the organization's reputation, the lawyers for the Watchtower began directly questioning the victims. In the miniseries, we even see the judge reprimanding the lawyer for Jehovah's Witnesses for attempting to reopen matters that had already been ruled on by other courts. For example, at one moment, one of the lawyers says something like this to a victim: "You claim that being among Jehovah's Witnesses caused you psychological harm, but you have siblings, and it did not cause psychological harm to them. Why did it harm you?" But that argument is frankly absurd. Each person's experience is individual. That is precisely why we are individuals. Besides, we do not even know whether that person's siblings suffered psychological harm or not. And even if they did not, that does not mean the person testifying did not suffer it. At a key moment, the victim gives a very simple answer, but powerful, direct. "All I know is that I have spent many years unable to hug my nieces, unable to hug my family." Those kinds of testimonies were what made the judge begin to understand what was really happening. According to reports, more than 70 victims testified during the trial, one after another, and there came a moment when the judge literally held her head in her hands as she listened to the things these people had lived through. She also saw how the lawyers for the Watchtower tried to turn children against their parents, to suggest that the victims were exaggerating or even inventing their testimonies. All of this was exposed during the trial. And finally, the verdict arrived. We have to say that the verdict was historic. The judge did not simply rule against Jehovah's Witnesses, determining that the Spanish Association of Victims had the right to exist, and that the victims had the right to call themselves victims. In addition, in her ruling, the judge even used the term destructive sect to refer to Jehovah's Witnesses. In the documentary, you can see how the victims described the moment when the judge delivered her verdict. It was truly historic. They raised their arms in victory, filled with joy over the favorable ruling. So yes, it was a historic verdict. And this is where I want to insist on something very important. None of this negative publicity against Jehovah's Witnesses would have happened if they themselves had not decided to sue the Spanish Association of Victims. It was their own arrogance, and also their lack of sensitivity toward the victims, that led them to make that mistake. When Jehovah's Witnesses decided to sue the association, they were essentially shooting themselves in the foot. Most likely, if they had not filed that lawsuit, the association would have continued to exist, speaking in different forums, on the internet and on social media. And those who wanted to listen would listen, and those who did not simply would not. But by filing the lawsuit, they turned the issue into something much bigger. And on top of that, the twisted, aggressive, and, it must be said, dishonest way they behaved during the court hearings ended up producing exactly the opposite effect of what they were trying to achieve. In the end, what they accomplished was that many more people became aware of how Jehovah's Witnesses actually operate. And that is also one of the reasons why documentaries like the HBO one exist today. That documentary probably would not exist if Jehovah's Witnesses had not sued the Association of Victims. That is why I insist. All of this negative publicity is not the devil's fault. It is not the fault of the so-called evil apostates. It is their own fault. This is what happens when arrogance takes over. This is what happens when victims are treated with cruelty. This is what happens when an ideology reaches a point where it has completely lost empathy for other human beings. And when an organization loses empathy, when it stops listening to the suffering of those who have been harmed, sooner or later, reality catches up with it. If you want to continue learning about Jehovah's Witnesses, and in particular about how the organization has reconstructed, manipulated, and even invented parts of its own history, click on the video I've placed in the upper right corner, and in the lower right corner, you'll also find a link to a complete playlist where I analyze the history of Jehovah's Witnesses in greater detail. Bye.